my name is Craig Lambert. I am a professional writer who was an editor and staff writer here for many years at Harvard Magazine. I retired a few years ago, but I still contribute stories to the magazine on occasion when it's a story that attracts my attention or possibly the magazine's attention.
Amazing. Where do you get your ideas?
Well, ideas are a very interesting thing for writers. Sometimes people think of writing as inspiration. You've got to have inspiration. Well, it sounds nice, sounds poetic. But the thing is, as a professional writer, you can't wait around for inspiration. You have got deadlines. You've got to produce in a regular way, and you've got to be reliable about it. The idea of inspiration, you just can't wait for it, nor can you tolerate writer's block. There's no such thing as writer's block when you're professional. You imagine a surgeon coming into the operating room and saying, "Oh, can't operate today. I have surgeon's block. Sorry, no operation." No, you've got to be a professional about it. So ideas do come from all kinds of places. I once was watching a NFL football game a couple of years ago, and I heard the color commentator mention that the referee for that particular game, Ron Torbert, was a Harvard Law graduate. I said, "What? That guy's got a Harvard Law degree and he's an NFL referee? That's a story." Obviously, you put two and two together. How rare is that? And indeed, Ron Torbert was a very eminent referee who had done the Super Bowl the year before. He's a black guy, 57 years old, had a whole career as a lawyer. He loved Harvard Law. He loved being in a business sector lawyer. And he had done a lot of officiating. And he eventually got to leave law in his 50s and become a full-time official in the NFL. Another case was Chris Wallace. He's a guy happened to be a college classmate of mine, the son of the famous Mike Wallace, and Chris is pretty famous himself. He was a news mainstay on Fox News for, I guess, 15 or 20 years when I approached him about doing a profile for Harvard Magazine. And he was a guy who was a real newsman. He did professional conduct in the news. He tried to stay on the point of the facts and have an objective, unbiased point of view. And he did that in the middle of what everyone recognizes a very partisan source of news, Fox News. But all the news sources are that way now. And he was kind of a fish out of water. But he held his own. He did it his way. And he said Roger Ailes, who had hired him, was very supportive all the way through and never pressured him to lean to the right of center on any story. He just wanted him to be balanced of it and to ask just as hard questions to the Democrats as he did to the Republicans. So those are places where new ideas can come from. Sometimes I will get an idea just from being approached. In this case of the story about Steve Bergman, John Rosenberg, the editor here, gave me a call and said, "We'd like to do a feature on Steve Bergman and his writing. Would you be interested?" And I was.
What does the research process look like for that?
Well, researching an article is the biggest part of the work when you come right down to it. When you are involved in digging up the facts and interviewing the subject or subjects, that takes more time than anything else. I used to say that doing a story, I can't write anything until I know everything. Everything meaning everything that satisfies my curiosity, the things I think are relevant or pertinent. There is the side of it which involves documents and digging, and of course we can now do a lot of that with Wikipedia, which has advanced a great deal, and it has got lots of footnotes, and it's not the unreliable source it was once accused of by any means, because it is crowdsourced, and being crowdsourced means it's almost the only place you can get unbiased version of facts, because the people's biases of the probably millions of Wikipedia editors cancel each other out. I mean, doctors read Wikipedia because they don't want to wait for the next meeting of the Endocrinological Society next year. They want something right now, and it's being updated every day. So I use Wikipedia a lot. I support them with donations, and that's just one example, though. You dig anywhere you can to get documentary evidence, but usually the bigger part is finding the right people to interview and doing them. In the case of the Healing Cortez story on Steve Bergman, he was the main source of information. I did 3 interviews with Steve, and that was all I needed to do. In a bigger story about a topic like I did once on behavioral economics, I probably interviewed 8 professors at Harvard, business school, economics department, whatever, in order to get a rounded and varied view of a emerging at that time discipline within the economics field.
And what does it look like when you sit down to write?
Well, the writing part itself has got its own fascination. It gives you a certain feeling inside that you have when you're solving a problem, maybe. There's an emergent thing, I think. Fiction writers get the same thing when the novel starts to tell its story to them, and the characters start to speak in their own voices. And in a nonfiction context, what I do is I go through all my notes, and I make little 3x5 cards with a summary of the ideas, the main ideas, and a note at the bottom as to where that came in my notebooks, because I'm old-fashioned. I actually write down my notes when I'm interviewing someone with pen and paper. Recordings have their use. They do show up, but if you have a recording, then you've got to go through the whole recording again and find where everything is, and I would rather just have the notebook. So I make my 3x5 cards, I get a stack of them, and then I sort the cards into piles depending on what they have in common. There's certain themes within any story. So I have the little piles of cards that are related. And then I go over to my cork board in my study, and I use push pins and put up columns of the 3x5 cards based on the organizational scheme that has then emerged. When I have them all laid out there, and there could be a few dozen of them. I mean, it could be 80 cards, I don't know, depending on how much research, how big the story is. Very often I can see the lead sentence and paragraph right there. It'll be that one. That's where we'll start. I like to start with a story, if I can, rather than an abstraction of any kind, unless it's a hell of an abstraction. And I can often see the end, too. The card will be apparent to me. That's where this story would have a nice close, a nice end. It's usually a quote from perhaps the lead subject if it's a profile, or just a very pithy quote from one of the people I interviewed. A long time ago, I wrote a story, was a cover article about globalization, and I ended with a quote from Ted Levitt, who was a legendary professor of marketing at Harvard Business School, and he talked about Sol Hurok, who had been a famous impresario in New York. He was a Russian guy who brought people like the Bolshoi Ballet and major classical musicians from Europe over to perform in New York, and usually with great success, but not always. And Sol Hurok, the impresario, said one time that you don't always sell tickets, and if the people don't want to come, nothing in the world can stop them. Okay, and that was the last sentence I used in the story on globalization. It just seemed right. So after that, when I start the actual writing, let's say I found the lead sentence, I write that, and a feature article opens itself up to you by essentially each paragraph poses a question which leads to the next paragraph, and that kind of opens a question that leads to the following paragraph. So it's like a thread that opens up paragraph by paragraph and leads you through the story in a way that's logical and meets the reader's curiosity. And what my test always in interviewing or writing is, am I curious about this? This is interesting to me. You've got to play on both sides of the desk to be a good writer. You've got to be a reader. We're all readers before we are writers. And if you are sincere about that and you do it right, you will keep your reader interested because you're identifying with them as you do the writing. So as each time I complete a thought, I take the push pin out and I remove the index card from the corkboard, and it gets sparser and sparser as you go along, moving towards the end of the story. And there are always a few left when I'm done because I got to the end of the article and I didn't need some of those ideas. But that process has worked for me. I've heard screenwriters tell me they use something very similar with cards. Index cards seems like an old-fashioned technology, but they still have an ability that you can't really replicate online, to be moved around in any way, in any order, and removed like that, and also to be able to look at the whole corkboard at once, which on a computer screen is just not possible to do, to see all your concepts grouped on the same platform, the same screen. So that has served me well, and I think it's at least it organizes my progress as a writer to go through the story in that way, and I find it a very useful tool.
So what did each of these phases look like for the Bergman piece specifically?
Well, with the Steve Bergman story, the idea part was very easy. John Rosenberg, the editor here at Harvard Magazine, called me up and said we're thinking of doing a story on the fiction, the writing of Steve Bergman, who wrote The House of God, and he has some new books coming out too. Would you be interested? And I thought about it, and I got back to John. I said, yeah, sure, I would like to write about Steve. I had known him for 40 years. Actually, 40 years ago, but I hadn't seen him for my 38 or 39 of those years. We just took separate paths. So it was a pleasure to get back in touch with Steve, and that got things going. I gave Steve a call. He was very happy to hear from me again. He only lives a few miles away out in Newton, and I went out there to interview him, which I did 3 times. I brought my dog with me, and we sat in his studio, or actually it's a carriage house behind his main house where he and his wife Janet live, and he does have his real writing room there, his desk, and we sat in a different area. This house is large enough to live in, and he and his wife did live in there for quite a few years and rented out the main house before they decided to move into the main house themselves. But they still have this very nice carriage house. So we sat there for 2 or 3 hours per session. Me with my notebook and Steve reclining in his chair there, and talked. When I do an interview, I like to think of it as a conversation. Not just me, the question asker, and the subject, the answerer. I volunteer thoughts too. I bring up my ideas like you would with any friend or anyone you're having a conversation with. It seems to create a more natural flow to the exchange, and you feel like we're both participants in a way, and it may help open people up. I remember I did interview the famous economist John Kenneth Galbraith a few times here, and with Ken Galbraith, it was never like that. He did the talking, and he was one guy that you really were glad to let him monopolize the conversation, because everything he said was so interesting. I didn't want to be, chipping in with my penny ante thoughts when I had Ken Galbraith. It was fascinating. But for the most part, I like that conversational model, and Steve and I had enough conversation that I came back twice to complete the job. The process began probably. I agreed to do this story in about 2 months, 2.5 months before I submitted the text as a finished text. So it stretched out over that. But like I said, the research takes the most time. Not only in terms of the physical time you have doing the research, but the spacing out of the time over it could be a course of weeks when the subject is available, when your schedule is available, when you set them up. And even after the first interview, I wanted to wait at least a week or 2 before going back again to just let things sort of settle in, and so some of the ideas that help prepare me for questions to ask. So that went pretty well. We had good conversation, and then I more or less brought the material home and distilled it and brought out my index cards, as I always do, as I described, and knocked off the draft, and I think pretty much we were all pretty happy with how it turned out, including Steve himself, which I always think is important at the subject of an article, whether they be a writer, an athlete, an artist of any kind, that if they feel that I represented them accurately, that I correctly produced what it's like to do the thing they do and do so well, usually, that's satisfying.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Good to be here.